Mhm. Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Maisris, Pedig Beis, Halacha Dalet. We are learning the final daf in the second chapter, Daf Chaf, and we will begin all the way on top of the Amid. So we are still in the sugya of the biblical entitlement for a worker to be allowed to eat from the product that he is working with in a very narrow and limited window. He has to be working with something that grows from the ground. He's working with it even when it's still attached, but his work is to detach it. The product may not have yet reached its gemar malacha. During that window, the worker is allowed to eat if he's hungry, but he's not allowed to hoard it or take it home to eat at a later time. And the pasuk reads in Parshas Kiseitze that kisavoi bekerem re'echa, that if you will you will enter the vineyard of your fellow. And we're speaking dafka, as we just learned, someone who is a hired worker, not even a volunteer worker. Ve'achalta anavshim, ve'achalta anavim that you are allowed to eat the grapes. Vineyard has grapes to your full soul's desire. We'll have details about this today. However, you can only eat it by manually taking it off the vine and eating it. But the el kalicha loisitein, but you may not put it in a utensil. So reads the pasuk. We're going to begin today's daf with a braisa that will expound many different words in the pasuk. We're going to actually have a machlokes tanoim whether a worker is allowed to eat the value in excess of his wage. In other words, what happens if he's working with an item that's very expensive and he's getting paid $100 a day? Is he allowed to eat more than that $100? Machlokes tanoim. We will see a novel interpretation of the words nefesh, right? Va'achalta anavshim, anavim kinafshecha sovecha. What is nefesh? We'll see that nefesh can also refer to one's wage, right? People give their nefesh to make a living. Very interesting. We will also learn. We're going to come back to this correlation that similar is that we have by a worker, we have by an animal, that a person is not allowed to muzzle his or her animal while the animal is threshing. However, even though the mouth has to be free, but the owner or the worker is allowed to feed that animal prior to threshing foods that are much less expensive than the grain. And by the way, the same thing will be with the workers. In other words, the owner of the employer is allowed to feed the workers. Why not? So they're going to be more satisfied. Don't forget, they're not allowed to hoard. They cannot gather the grape. As an example, they can only eat it while they're working. And as we'll see, they can only eat it if they're hungry. So you are allowed to, sometimes it's advantageous for the employer to give a gazunta meal of, rice and beans. And so when they're working, they're not going to eat up that amount of food. The Gemara will also clarify exactly when does the entitlement end. What's pshat? They can eat while they're working. When does the work end? We'll see. It's not so pashit. And just for the record, there is a Mishnah Bava Metzia that speaks about someone who hired the worker to guard even their produce. Mida'iraisa, guarding produce, is not considered working with the produce. And therefore, mida'iraisa, the worker has no entitlement to partake of whatever it is that he's guarding, even during the time that they're guarding. Nevertheless, B'lashon HaMishnah, by the law of convention, in other words, it became common practice and acceptable for a guard also to be allowed to eat from that which he is guarding. That's an agreement that we made amongst each other, but that's not a biblical entitlement, and we will see the consequences of that today. And finally, we're going to be allowed to be ma'arim. That means if a person wants to really sell his figs, problem is the buyer knows that the moment he buys it, mekach will activate the kvius, and the buyer will not be allowed even to snack. In the case where the buyer wants to snack, the buyer and the seller can make, to circumvent mekach, they can make, you know what? Instead of me buying it from you, hire me, and independent of the money that he's giving. And as your worker now, I'm going to be entitled to eat. And he tells him, listen, I'm hire me to work with 10 figs. 9 of them I'm going to eat, and 1 of them I'll let out to dry. You're hiring me to dry your figs. And it's clear the whole thing is a harama that will be allowed, which will allow now this person to eat it achila sarai. And at the end of the daf, at the end of the Pedic, we're going to focus on the last part of the Mishnah. The last part of the Mishnah speaks about barter. That barter is also a form of mekach, which therefore l'chu'ura should mean that when I exchanged my produce with your produce, none of us can eat achila sarai because there was a change of ownership through mekach. Nevertheless, the Mishnah spoke about a scenario where the buyer and the seller have different intentions. One of them will eat it the way it is. One of them plans still to dry it out. In other words, one of them views that which he is receiving as an item shaloi nigmana malachtoi. And really, the question will be, and that was the way we learned, correct, the machlokes tanoim in the Mishnah, that the Tanakama holds, very much like Rabbi Meir, that mekach establishes a kavius even b'davar shaloi nigmana malachtoi. However, Rabbi Yehuda holds that when is mekach koiveya only on davar sheyes nigmana malachtoi. But if someone is exchanging and their plan is to let it out to dry, so the one hamachliv loichal, the one who exchanged and is receiving something that he will eat as is, that means that he received something that is for him is nigmana malachtoi. Mekach triggers the kavius and he's chayiv to be ma'aserit. He's not allowed to eat it as a snack. But the Rabbi Yehuda holds that the one that is going to be receiving, let's say figs, and his intention is liktsois to then still dry it out, that means from his perspective, it's not nigmar malachtoi, even though he bought it, not with money, with a barter, or with money, he's going to be potter. He, yes, will be allowed to eat it arai, because mekach can only be kiveyam, and we learned that Rambam clearly paskins like Rabbi Yehuda. This is today's daf, Chevra daf Chaf, Amud Aleph, all the way on top of the Amud. So the pasuk reads, "Ve'achalta anavim," right? "Ve'achalta anavim kenafshe chosovecha." So asks the Braisa, "V'chi ein anu yodim she'ein bekerem loichal ela anavim." In other words, the Torah says, "Kisove bekerem reyacha." The Torah is telling you that the worker is entitled to eat. V'achalta, es gesund to eat. Why does it say anavim? So matamalomi v'achalta anavim. Question. Answers the Tana, answers the Braisa Elamikan. This is the chiddush of the Torah. She'im hoya oisa bite enim lo yoichal ba'anavim or ba'anavim lo yoichal bite enim. You are only allowed to eat the type of fruit in which or in whose work you are currently engaged in, which means even if the owner owns other fruits, it's important. And even if you are actually hired to work with both, I'm a worker, I'm working for you, you own a fig tree, you own a vineyard. I was hired to pick both. While I'm working in the vine, I'm not allowed to eat the figs. Only eating while I'm working with that product. Okay, weiter. Then it says kinafshecha. So that here the pshat, the taich, the mikra, the pshat of the mikra is kinafshecha, that you may eat the grapes as you desire. As you desire means as much as you want. Kol davar shayetzer to'ev. This is very important. Look inside the Rashirilio. Top one, first one on the right column. Kol davar shayetzer to'ev. As we learned, a Mishnah Bava Metzia, that poyel oichel kishus, that if the poyel is working with the kishus, he's allowed to eat even a dinar's worth, or afilu kishus that's so expensive that's worth a dinar, you are allowed to eat. But you would think maybe if the item is extremely expensive, there's a limit. This Braisa learns that's the pshat of the word kenafshecha, as you desire. When you're eating it and you want it, you can eat it. Doesn't matter how much it costs. Next Braisa.
How is it different than malek so?
That's exactly what it means. Yeah. Yeah. Don't you don't have to limit yourself. Kenafshecha means be free. Freedom. Kenafshecha, another din that we learn from kenafshecha. You would think, again, that since I am working for you, anything that I get to eat in lieu of my work, whether the owner gave it to me, whether Hashem granted it to me, one might have viewed it as an exchange for the work, which it is. Mekach establishes a kvius, which would mean that I should not be allowed to snack on it. That's the kenafshecha. Shepatur min ha'maisres, also a type of freedom. In other words, feel free to eat it. You don't have to. You don't worry about mekach. By the way, just for the record, mekach is koveya midrabanan, midoiraisa. That which is koveya is only re'iyas penei habayis. Obviously, this is an asmachta. In other words, it can't be that Hashem is writing a word to address something that doesn't have to be addressed biblically. And a chanami, doesn't matter. Chazal did it very often. Once they gave us a din derabanan of the shisha devarim, mekach is koveya, they go back into the pasuk and they interpret words in the pasuk to be addressing their rabbinic law. Befrat al pi chasidus, just to remember that it's gavaldik that dinei Torah come from one level, and dinei derabanan come from a higher level. It's unbelievable. The Torah, the oil that is invested in dinei derabanan is a higher level of godly light than the light that's invested in dinei Torah. So then that makes it even easier to appreciate why there has to be a word in the Torah to address dinei derabanan. Okay, so shapatim in ha'maisres, meaning that just like you means ma'at oichelu pater, just like the owner. Kenafshecha, like you, the owner. Just like the owner eats, if he's snacking, he has no restriction. The problem is only having a achilas keva. But if you want to just, you have a desire and you want to nash, no problem. Afpoil, like the worker, oichelu pater. No, it's kenafshecha means immediately, or kenafshecha means like you. That's the word. Kenafshecha means like the owner. The worker is like the owner. Like what? There's no mekach by the owner. There's no mekach that triggers kavius by the poil, because, like we learned, because it's a biblical entitlement and it doesn't fall in the category of mekach. Weiter, another taich, kenafshecha, mikan, the opposite of what we learned before. Before we learned the first brayse, we learned kol davar shahayetzer toiv. If you're working with something that's worth a dinar and you're getting paid a shekel, you can eat it. Here it says the opposite. That mikan shelo yoichel hapoil yoiser al schoroi. Can't eat more. The word nefesh means wage. Why does nefesh mean wage? Ki benafshe yavi lachmei. I'm saying my own pasuk. In other words, people invest their soul in their work. So God is saying, okay, you can eat, but only kin nafshecha, not yoiser mi nafshecha. The opposite limit. And mikan hoye Rabbi Elazar chisma omer that lo yoichal hapoil yoisel ascharoi. So we have a machlokes tanoim. Kenafshecha means your wage. So asks the Gemara minayin shenafshe kru ascharoi. How do you get to that? What's the source of this interpretation? So Rabbi b'shem Rabbi Yosi ben Chanina, he says like this. Nemar kan here in our pasuk that we just read in Kiseitze, right? It says nafshe. The Nemer Lahalon happens to be another pasuk in Parshas Kiseitze, and let me read the pasuk in Torah Yerushalmi b'yoymoi titein scharai, that if you hire a worker to work for the daytime or for the nighttime, when the norm is for them to be day laborers, they get paid for their work. You have to pay them within 12 hours from when they finished working. So if someone works during the day, they finish working at night, they have to get their payment at night. Both an asay and a lav. If a person is a night worker, and that's the norm, that they get paid after they finish their shift. I'm saying that because if the norm is they work during the day, today in America, most people get paid once a month or twice a month. There's no problem with that because that's the understanding. But if the understanding, let's say today's understanding, that people get paid on the 5th, you have to pay them on the 5th. Delaying wages of a worker is a violation of a mitzvah saseh and a mitzvah sloi saseh. There are tshuvas written Erev Shabbos when people have house help that the obligation of paying them when they finish working supersedes the mitzvah of having good foods on Shabbos, without doubt. And many people, they ate pas b'melach, but they paid their house help if they had to pick and choose. Let me just read the pasuk. V'yoymei titen schorei, v'loi sovei anega, v'loi sovei olav hashemesh, ki anihu ve'elav hu noise es nafshoi. And v'lo yikra lecha l'Hashem v'hoy b'cha chet. Gewaldig. And how fortunate are those who pasha to experience people around them when it came to paying salaries, how they were mamash moisen nefesh, never to pay workers late. And the challenge of many people, unfortunately, that grew up in societies where teachers were allowed to be paid late. You have this. It's hard. You have to break out of that. It became like an acceptable thing, but thank God I never saw that. Okay, never come nafshoy, v'nem lahalan din nafshoy, mamish. Ve'elov funoises nafshoy. In other words, if the worker won't receive his salary, his soul is in peril. His nefesh is at risk. So ma nafshoy amura lahalan. The word nefesh is in reference to his wage. Schorei afkan kin nafshecha. You can only eat max the value of your wage and not beyond that. How beautiful. Min akotze el akotze. Desire or salary. Sovecha, the Torah says sovecha. So what does sovecha teach you? Another thing. You can eat, but once you are satiated, eating beyond your satiation is prohibited and you're stealing. Shelo yehi oichelu meiki. Oichelu meiki, just to know, when you eat more than what you need, that's called a disgusting eating. If you remember in the whole dinner of Korban Pesach, that whole thing that on one hand, you want to eat till you're full. That's why we brought the Chagigas Yud Dalid many times, because people were so scared not to have noiser on the Korban Pesach, so they got many people on one lamb. Everyone got their kazayas, but you got a little piece, but you're hungry. So you would eat other meat, not until you're full, until you're almost full. And then you would have the Korban Pesach that would be, but eating beyond, to be aware of that. And Shtam Lahoyer, that we just learned now in Hilchos Deis and the Rambam, and this is about habit, that the ideal way of eating is to eat until you are 3/4 full. And that would be the salvecha. Once people get into that habit, you get used to it. When people never eat until they're full, because it's disgusting, it's not healthy, and it doesn't feel good. Then when you eat until when you're full, you don't feel good. So it's like but if someone needs, wherever your point is, going beyond that is something that you're not allowed to eat. Another din salvecha. Now, when you eat, many people, when they eat a fig, some people, they eat the whole fig because you're hungry with the peel. Some people, they become finicky people, and they say that the outer part of the fig is not so clean. So they open up, remember, they break the fig open, and they suck out the innards. Same thing with grapes. Some people, they don't eat the whole grape. They suck out the pneumias of the grape, and then the rest they throw away. I'm not allowed to do that if I'm a worker, because if I am your worker and I'm eating that way, to reach my satiation, I'm going to take more of your grapes, right? Because I'm eating less of each grape. So I have to be mindful about that. I'm not allowed to be mekalav b'ta'enim. I'm not allowed to be matzmeitz ba'anovim. Eat the whole grape. Eat the whole fig. Taka eat. Kenafshecha. But be careful. This whole thing again that we learned in the last year, how bad chamas is, how bad theft is, that God let us go until the limit. In many other dinei Torah, we're not allowed to go until the limit. We put boundaries. Here, there's no boundaries. No, it's here because of the virtue of working. We want the worker to eat till the boundary. What's the boundary? Beyond your satiation. Don't throw out any part of the food that you're eating that you're not allowed to do, because then you're going to end up eating one grape more, and you're not allowed to do that. Next then, says the Braisa, Rishoyim, Hapoyalim l'tabel imay betzir. Workers are allowed to eat with their employer before they go out to work. Now, guys, salty foods, we all know that. When you eat something salty, you become thirsty. When you become more thirsty, you're gonna want to eat more. Really, what you want is you just want to get hydrated. But most people don't understand that. Most times, even when we are hungry, what we really need is the water. What we eat. So the question is, can a worker have salty foods prior to working? Why not? Because that's going to make him need, so to say, more grapes, more figs. The answer is yeah. So he doesn't have to be mindful about, I'm not allowed to do that before. You can eat. He can eat bishvil sheyoichlo anovim harbe. Now, on the other hand, the owner is allowed to give them prior to working wine, Bishvil shelo yochlo anavim harbe. Which each one has a different agenda. It's how ironic it is. You would think you don't want your workers to be drunk, right? First of all, people didn't get drunk as quick. Second of all, maybe for the balabas, for the type of work that you were doing, it was more beneficial for the owner, for the employer, for the worker to be a bissel shikir, but for him to eat less. When people are shikir, they here, it sounds like they eat less. The people that I know, once they get shikir, they don't stop eating. So maybe the different type, the shikir, nishtanu hatevim of a shikir. All right, weiter. Next, say now we're going to go.
You have a little wine in your meal, then you're not going to want more.
The Gemara says in Ksubas that having a cup of wine before your meal opens up your appetite.
A little bit.
So I'm just saying, because the Gabi said a little bit. I think he wasn't a little bit.
I'm saying, yes, in between.
Whatever it is. Okay, good. However it works. And when it comes to the din of not muzzling the animal, let's say I have a cow and I hire out my cow. So part of I'm a Yerushalmi, Talmud Yerushalmi. Part of I'm not only going to get money for renting out my cow, but you will have to allow my cow to eat your food. I won't even feed my cow supper the night before. Let my cow be hungry. So he'll eat double when he threshes your grain. You're allowed to do that to a certain limit, not tzar balachayim. No, it's the same idea. Rishoi balapar is the one who's not doing the threshing. He's the one that's renting out his cow. Lahariva balayla b'shvil shotoichal harbe. And on the other hand, the balabas that's renting the cow, who's going to use the cow to thresh grain, which is expensive, he's allowed to feed to the cow something inferior right before the threshing. It's like when you go to these places, they give you anything but steak. So by the time they serve the meat, you're full already. So you'll eat less steak. Banditin. You understand? Rishoi bal habayis la'achila pkiye omed. The balabas can give the cow straw. So the cow is going to be filled with who knows what, with something insignificant. So b'shas is being dush on grain, he won't eat that much. That's not called muzzling. It's about when you're eating, however you feel, you should have the freedom to eat, and that is happening both by the worker and by the animal. Rababo Omer, hasrigo levahamin. Now there are different ways of teaching it. We're going to teach it that you are allowed to feed esroigim to animals right prior to threshing. Esroigim doesn't taste that good. Just an example. And what do you do with your esrig after Yontif? Nothing. It has no value to you. So you can even feed your behema esroigim prior to threshing, so the animal should already, I think maybe not only will it fill up the animal, maybe the esrig makes the animal lose the appetite. Maybe a gorazoi. That's also not considered muzzling. I don't think because it's citrus. I think because it's Rab Chananya mechlon devel. Rab Chananya would give his animals pressed figs. Rab Mana mechlon is tafnine, wild carrots. All of these were items that in the times of Chazal, they were less expensive than grain. In other words, not only a theoretical halacha, that these Tanoim actually did it, or these Amoraim actually did it. So they never muzzled their animals. I think that all of these items, not only did they satiate the animal, I think they took away the appetite. Okay, whatever it is, that's not called muzzling. As long as when the animal is threshing, the animal has nothing covering his mouth and he has access to the grain and he can eat. Shalom al Yisrael. Then you're doing good. Tani Rabbi Chia, Abraisa. Oichel poyel eshkol rishon. Now, let's begin. From when is he allowed to eat? Guys, he's not allowed to eat when the item is still attached, right? So let's say someone was hired to detach, to harvest 20, just give it 20 eshkoilas, just as a mashal. The worker is only allowed to eat while he's working. One might have thought, what's pshat working? At least one, he's harvesting for the owner. Now he's working for the owner. Now, if he's hungry, not beyond his hunger, he's allowed to eat. But can the worker eat the first? One might have thought, no. Instead, if I'm working for you, imagine if the first thing that I take off the tree, I eat. Maybe I'm not even working for you yet. The owner didn't get anything. That's what you would have thought. So there's a chiddush over here. Rabbi Chia is teaching a brisa that the poyel is even allowed to eat the first cluster of grapes. I get the chiddush. Why? Because it's not pshat, I'm hired to work for you to end up with grapes in your basket. I am hired to harvest. The moment I begin to harvest, I'm working. I'm your worker. It's like many workers, they go on vacation on the first day of work. You'll find this. My father had this thing with the painters, the Brazilian painters. They would come here with a big ladder. He would make fun of the ladders. They have to paint something that's a big ladder. Koydem kol, they would come and they would need money. They would come with the ladder, they need money to buy material. Then they would disappear for a week because they drank beer. Then they would come back and they said they went on vacation and now they're ready to work, but they need a little bit more money. Verstehst? You can go on vacation before you start work. You can eat before you gave anything to the worker. Another chiddush, you can even eat the last eshkoil. Same chiddush. You would think if I'm hired to pick for you, so let's say there were 20 clusters, and I'm picking 19. There's only one left. Think about it. If I eat the last, one might say, well, I'm eating after I finished working, because you didn't get the last one. You only got 19. I'm not allowed to eat after I finished working. The Brisa says I am allowed to eat. If I was hired to pick 20, this is the 20th. Even though you are not getting it. Now, from the perspective of the employer, he can argue, well, you weren't working for me when you ate the last one. V'haraya, you ate it. It's not true. I was hired to harvest, and I can eat the first one, and I can eat the last one. That's a big chiddush. Rab Shmuel b'shem Rab Hila. So when does my entitlement end? When does it end? When I put the last cluster in the basket. That's the word. I'm hired to work with clusters. The moment I'm done with the clusters, that's it. Now I can't eat. He's saying the same word. Amar Rabbi Yosi, loy chen tzricha, b'shahayohu boitzer va'achar moilech. This was relevant where someone else was hired to carry the baskets to other locations. In other words, if I was hired both to pick and to transport, transporting is called work. Guarding is not, like I mentioned in the intro. By common agreement, even a guard can eat. We'll get back to that in a moment. Walking, schlepping is called working, biblically. So if I was hired to harvest and then to take it to the warehouse, of course I can eat the last eshkoil. Why not? Of course, because I'm in the middle of working. Rabbi Yosi is saying the chiddush of Rab Shmuel b'shem Rab Hila is that both the chiddush lekula and lechumra, that if I am not hired to do any transportation, my job is only to harvest. So what's the end of my work? The end of my work is when I placed it in the basket, which means, on one hand, when I took off the last one off the vine, I am allowed to eat it because I'm still harvesting. If I eat it, it turns out that you, employer, you're not getting it. It doesn't matter. I'm hired to harvest. I'm harvesting. The moment I put it in the basket, since I was dafka, not hired to transport, that's where my job ends. And from that point on, I'm no longer allowed to eat. However, and not only was he hired to do the bitzira, to do the picking, to do the harvesting, but he was also hired to be moilech, to do the transportation. So batchila oichel mishum hilchos medina. So first of all, before he begins, let me tell you, this harvesting, you put it in the baskets, and then when the baskets are full, I'm going to go and schlep it. Now, he's saying something very technical. In between the harvesting and the transporting, there is something else that I am responsible for. And I'm going to use the word guarding. Don't forget, if my job is to fill up 20 baskets, and I have to get the 20 baskets to your warehouse, I need to see to it that no one takes from it, no one steals any of the baskets. The act of only guarding biblically is not called working. Why not? Because the Torah says both kisava bekerem reyecha and both kisava bekamas reyecha. The Torah was speaking about someone who's working with the product. Guarding the product, it's not called working with it. It's not asay toiv, it's just asur mira. So first of all, just this is a Mishnah in Bava Metzia. It's not a Chiddush from the Amoraim, but it's good to review it. That even though the biblical entitlement for a worker does not apply to someone who's only a guard, nevertheless, this is called Hilchos Medina. That's an expression. Hilchos Medina means by the law of convention. Hilchos Medina means that it was common practice that we the Jewish people, agreed mutually that whatever God gave as a biblical entitlement to a worker when they're working, which means harvesting, which means schlepping, transporting, same will go to a guard. So coming back to our case over here, when are we saying that the moment I put the clusters in the basket, that ended my entitlement? If I was only hired to package, to put in the basket. But if I was hired to put in the basket and to transport, so I'm harvesting, I'm guarding, and I'm transporting. My work doesn't end when I finished harvesting. Even after I finished harvesting, both when I'm still only guarding and when I'm transporting, I am still allowed to eat. But there's a difference. When I'm actually schlepping it, I can eat it midin toida. When I am transporting it, I can eat it mehilchis medina. Let's read it. Batchila means prior to me picking up these baskets that are already full, which means it's during my time where I am guarding it. I am entitled to eat it. We're calling that Hilchos Medina. The other opposite is called Hilchos Poyalin. Hilchos Poyalin means the biblical entitlement. Hilchos Medina, like we said, is that no, by Torah you're not entitled, but we accept it upon ourselves that that's fine. Beautiful. And where do we get that from? From a Mishnah Bava Metzia that ha-poyalim are oichen bahalichasan mu'uman lu'uman. Mu'uman lu'uman means not when they're schlepping. Again, schlepping is hilchos poyalim. When they are simply walking from one row to the other, and during that time they are responsible that whatever they did in the row prior, in row number one, should not be taken by anyone. That's why they are called workers. Or ubachaziros and minhagas, when they are returning from the white press. Or ubachamoir, same thing when it comes to an animal, that an animal that has stuff carrying on their back, when an animal has something that's on their back, that even when the animal is not schlepping, no. Just like by an animal, the opposite. By animal, midoi raisa can eat from what it's working with until when it's fully unloaded. And the Hilchos Medina is, a poil should be the same way. Even though be'emes, when something is on the back of an animal, the animal can eat midoi raisa, or because of the din of loisachsoi. When a worker is only guarding midoi raisa, he has no such entitlement. But that's the Mishnah, that hapoyalim oichlen b'halichosam chazirosim minagas, like the bechamoir, until when it's poidekes. Now, before we go to the last part of the Mishnah. So all of this came from number one, Mekach is koiveya. And now the Mishnah was machadesh that the biblical entitlement is not koiveya. So what happens then? I want to buy from you figs, and let's say I know these dinim, we just learned it together. I want to be allowed to snack on the figs, so I got myself a problem. The moment I do mekach, what's triggered? Kvius. Now, one way to do it would be to only get one at a time, but I don't want to get one at a time. So there's another way to circumvent the rule that mekach is koiveya. You know how? Instead of me being your purchaser, your loikeach, let me be your worker. Even though I'm going to agree to do a very small amount of work, and I'm telling you I'm going to be eating a lot of food. An employer would never allow for that to happen, but we're being honest. This is what we're doing. We're doing a ha'arama, and no problem. You are allowed to do it. Tani we learned in a Braisa. Is a rule that ha'arama is a lot more palatable by dinei derabanan than by dinei Torah, which explains everything, because mekach, like we said, is only kiveh miderabanan. Marim adam es al payalov. One can outsmart the system, can find a legal loophole by creating a so-called worker, meaning liyos oichlin teisha v'koitzenachas. So the guy is telling him, you know what? I want you to dry out my figs, but the em is only put one to dry. You have to put one to dry. If not, how are you my worker? Even though I know that you're going to end up taking 9. If I understand correctly, even if money is being exchanged. But we're going to say the money is a gift. Now you're the worker. And indeed, is Tanoi Taneim. There's a machlokes Tanoim regarding this din. So this Tana actually allows, imagine, the worker, if a worker is eating 9 and they're only letting 1 to dry, that's called a worker. You understand? He's doing a nothing for the employer, and he's taking 900% more for himself. Doesn't matter. It's called a harama. We know that, but that's fine. Another Tana says, no. Even when you make a harama, it has to be reasonable. It can't be on that level. The opposite. If you're putting out 9 to dry and you are only taking 1 for yourself, which is what probably the norm is, then and only then do we say that there is no mekach. But if you're not doing it in that ratio, then we don't allow such a harama. So the Gemara says, Nicha oichlin teisha v'koitzen achas. We understand the chiddush of the first version, the big chiddush, that even though de facto we all know that the person is going to end up taking 9, it's really a sale. And they're only putting 1 to dry. So there's a need for a braisa to tell you that that's allowed. But according to the second version, there's no novelty there. Why do we even have to write it? Koitzin, Teisha, v'oichlan achas, the Gemara would say, it's like pshita. This is not a ha'arama. How is that a ha'arama? The guy is working. He's taking he's only taking 10%. So Amar Rabbi Oven says, Shaloi toimar yei asa kila achad gemar melacha. You would think that since he's letting out 9 to dry first, and now he's taking 1, like we just learned above, maybe he should not have any such entitlement. Why not? Because if the last one that you're picking, you're eating, again, you would think it turned out that last one was not as a work for the employer. You're taking it. And if that would be the case, then you're not eating it mitzad the biblical entitlement. You're eating it because really you gave money before. Now it's a mekach. If it would be a mekach, then you would be a chayv to be ma'aser. And by the way, when it says 1, it doesn't mean 1, because we already learned before that even Rabbi Meir holds that when the purchaser is taking, if he takes only 1, if there's no tzeirof, it just means that proportion. In other words, the reason why there is a need, according to the second version, to say anything is just to back up what we said before, which is a chiddush, that the worker is even allowed to take the last one or the last ones. You would think ve'yechayev komash malan that we don't say that. Okay, great. So mekach is done by money. Then we spoke about the worker's entitlement. And then we said, by the way, if the worker is telling the employer, I'm working, but my son is eating, then that is called mekach. The son is not allowed to eat achila sarai because the employer agreed in exchange of work. That's called mekach. Mekach doesn't have to mean exchange of money. And that is the yisoid for the final din in the Mishnah, the final din in Pedek Sheni, that a barter is called a mekach. Mekach doesn't have to mean money, item for item. Mekach is koiveya. But here the Mishnah gave that other nuance, like we spoke at in the introduction, which is what were to happen. Let's say the barter is figs for figs, but Reuven is giving his type of figs, and he's getting Shimon's figs. Reuven plans to take Shimon's figs and to eat it the way it is. So that vadai, Reuven can't do. Why? Because he got it as a mekach. Mekach is koiveya. What happens if Shimon is planning to take the figs that he got from Reuven in exchange, but he still plans to dry them out? Which means from the perspective of Shimon, he's receiving a davar shaloi nigmar malachtoi. And here is the question whether mekach is koiveya ledavar shaloi nigmar malachtoi. That is where we had a machlokes in the Mishnah. The Tanakama holds that yes, that mekach is koiveya, even ledavar shaloi nigmar malachtoi, and we said this is shitas Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda holds that's the ending of the Mishnah, that hamachliv loichal chayiv, like we said, because he's planning to eat it. It's a davar shenigam malachtoi. But the one, in my example of Shimon, the liksois, the one who's receiving his figs and he's still planning to dry them out, pater. Those are the words of the Mishnah. So Nicha, Gemara wants to understand shitas Tanakama. Makes sense that the one who's receiving the figs, in my example, Reuven, who's receiving Shimon's figs, and he plans to eat them right away, that is chayiv, meaning he has to tie them prior to which he may not even eat arai. That makes sense. But why will the Tanakama say that the one who's receiving it and he plans to dry it out, Liksois is going to be chayiv? Why would it be chayiv? What's the question? It's a davar shaloi nigmar amalachtoi. And so answers the Gemara mamash what we said, that indeed Amar Rabbi Lazar, because the Tanakama is Rabbi Meir, or it's following the sheet of Rabbi Meir. Could be the Chachamim, other people sided with him. Nevertheless, the Rambam paskins like Rabbi Yehuda, the Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Meir says mikach toivel bepeiros even shaloi nigmar amalachton. Guys, we had this in the Mishnah Daf Tezayin. In other words, this is shitas Rabbi Meir. And Amar Rabbi Lazar, another din. Let's go even back to the beginning of the Perek. How did we begin? We began before we got into Mekach, like we mentioned. Mekach is going to go into the next chapter. The opening Mishnah of this chapter spoke about Truma, if you remember. And by Truma, we had the same question. Truma is one of the Shisha Devarim. Do we say that Truma is Koveya, even Ledavar, Shaloi Nigmar Amalachta? That was also a Machloikis. That was Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim. So Amar, the Amoyre Rabbi Lazar, the big expert in Truma Somaisris, that Rabbi Meir, which is the Tanakama of our Mishnah, which is Rabbi Meir in the Mishnah Daf Tezayin, and Rabbi Eliezer about Truma, Shneim Amru Davar Echad, we put them together. Come on, the Rabbi Eliezer, the Tana says, Truma Tevelas Beperis, even Shaloi Nigmar Amalachton. So holds Rabbi Meir, Mekach Toivel Beperis, Shaloi Nigmar Amalachton. And now we understand Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is understood. Rabbi Yehuda argues with Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda holds both l'chu'ura by Truma, because we're putting them together. Rabbi Yehuda will hold like the Chachamim against Rabbi Eliezer, that Truma is not koiveya the davar shaloi nigmar amalachton. Rabbi Yehuda holds that Mekach is also not koiveya the davar shaloi nigmar amalachton. Who establishes whether the davar is a davar shenigmar amalachton or not? One thing we found, the in between the lines, and this is a very important rule, is that the buyer is the one that establishes whether it's a davar shenigmar amalachton or not the seller. The buyer establishes it. Now, I want to say something, that the buyer had that machshava, had that intention while he was buying it. In other words, l'kula alma, if there was a barter or a sale, and the initial intention was, I'm taking these figs and I'm going to eat them fresh. During the Mekach, it was the way it is. Then he changed his mind. Too late. The Mekach was already Koveya. But during the sale, b'shas the sale, who determines whether this item is viewed as a davar shenigmar amalachton or not? From our sugi, this is already the second or the third time. The buyer's intention is the one that will halachically establish how we judge the product. The customer is always right, they say in America over here. In this case, it's very, very good. No, the ikir is not the seller. The ikir is the buyer. The ikir is not the nesinas hatoira. The ikir is the mekabli hatoira. Who makes the dira betachtoinim? Not the oibishter. We do it. We establish. And on that we say, Hadron Allah Chayover, Chavra Mazel Tov, and God willing, tomorrow we're starting the third chapter.